Okay, thanks so much for joining us tonight, everybody. My name is Ryan Pankau. I'm a horticulture educator with U of I Extension out of Champaign. So I cover Fort Iroquois, Champaign, and Vermilion counties. And so tonight we're going to talk about home composting. And this is actually what would have been an in-person monthly continuing education program hosted by the Vermilion County Master Gardeners. But in this day and age, we're going to actually meet virtually tonight and talk about composting. So I hope to bring to you guys just some practical tips for how you can start composting at home or be more successful in doing that. And this comes from just personal experience of mine over the past decade or so of trying to do home composting, some trial and error and other things. So hopefully have some good info for you tonight, and we can talk about that and maybe have a little bit of time for questions at the end. Okay, so what is compost? That's the first thing we need to kind of define. And so it's a product of waste material that's been broken down by microorganisms to create a bioactive material full of organic matter, nutrients, and beneficial microbes, and free of weed seeds and plant and animal pathogens. So that's a big key of it all. We don't want the bad stuff in. We want our compost processed down to the level that it's just this bioactive material full of organic matter. That's kind of the end goal. So why should we compost? Why are folks interested in composting these days? Why did I get into composting? Well, really some of these numbers of the waste produced in the US are one of the reasons why I really got interested in composting. And it was around the same time that I really started to own a home and have a garden of my own, and really also was concerned with building organic matter. But gosh, if you look at some of these numbers that, as Americans, we produce 40 million tons of food waste each year. And that's about 30 to 40% of our food supply goes into food waste. So that's a big number. And when you look at the fact that 97% of that food waste actually goes to a landfill and not our compost bins or another composting facility, those are some big numbers. So to kind of sum it all up and look at that bottom bullet point there, food waste is the single largest component of our landfills at about 22%. So if we can work to eliminate some of that food waste from landfills, we can recycle it into a great sustainably created soil amendment. So that was probably the second point of interest for me, was that I began a vegetable garden and I realized that I needed a lot of organic matter to add to my garden. So soil organic matter helps a garden in a lot of ways. First of all, it helps to maintain a loose, well-drained soil that doesn't compact easily. So we don't want our soil to easily compact as we step in it or if we have to move around in that garden a little bit. It also supplies plant nutrients and increases moisture retention. And one thing that I really like about organic matter, and it's also something to consider, is that it is truly a slow release form of nutrients. It's not something like a commercially prepared and purchased fertilizer that can actually leach through the soil profile and actually cause some water pollution issues. So it's a safer way to add nutrients to our soil. So what are some of the organisms that do this process for us or complete this composting process? Well, bacteria, actinomycetes, and fungi are probably the main microorganisms that complete this process for us. They're the most active and most important characters in composting, but there's also a ton of other animals that may contribute to this. And some of the larger, more macro-sized organisms, such as earthworms, is probably the common one that we think of a lot, but there's a ton of other insects that are a little larger that actually help in chopping and breaking up some of this material and help in this composting process. But we know it's these microorganisms that are the most important in this process. And so it's also important, and the most important group of all these microorganisms are the aerobic bacteria. So they do the brunt of the composting or the decomposition in our compost heap. It's important to note that they are aerobic, meaning they need air. We'll talk about this a little bit in a few more slides here, but when we start to lose air in our compost pile and it gets anaerobic, the decomposition process changes. And so it's not as efficient, doesn't work as well. So what do we have to pay attention to keep these bacteria happy and healthy and composting for us? Well, we'll talk about moisture, we'll talk about temperature, and we'll talk about the materials we add. So those are some of the main things that these guys need to stay healthy and to keep going. So on the point of oxygen and being anaerobic versus aerobic, when oxygen gets down to about 5%, then about 90% of these bacteria die. So that's a pretty important thing to remember. If we're getting these anaerobic conditions in our compost heap, we're losing up to 90% or more of these bacteria that are the main drivers of this process. They are really fueling the process, and they're truly the compost generators out of our heap. So, so for home composting, what are some recommendations? We're going to look at a number of different compost bins tonight, but if you're going to hot compost, so that's what we're talking about with aerobic bacteria doing most of this composting and with high temperatures. So we'll talk about this a little bit in another slide, but really the minimum recommendation is about a 3 foot by 3 foot by 3 foot pile, up to about 5 foot by 5 foot by 5 foot. So it's pretty sizable. It's not as small as you might think. The bins that you see pictured there are about 4 foot by 4 foot by 4 foot. So they're kind of right in the middle of that. But an even more important factor is that we want to have a good carbon to nitrogen ratio. So 25 to about 40 to 1 of carbon to nitrogen. So that's a lot more carbon than nitrogen in that ratio. So, however, most of us are probably doing a little less active form of compost, just as a way to reduce waste. And that's probably where I fall. I'm probably not in an optimal composting situation at my house. I have a lot of scraps from our house to compost somewhere. We have some farm animals at our house that are more like pets, more so than any kind of a farm. But we have waste from them that we need to compost as well. And then we have a large garden. So for us, it's a way to sustainably dispose of those materials and get something out of it. So I probably would fall into some of these categories of tending to be a little more piecemeal, not probably getting the hottest temperature, and possibly being a little slower than I could be. So if you can optimize all these things that we talk about tonight, you're going to have a higher quality compost and a lot faster. So that's what some of our discussion is going to focus on tonight. So hot composting and the carbon to nitrogen ratio are pretty important things to pay attention to. So we have to have enough, a favorable mix there. So, my last slide, I said 25 up to about 40 to 1. Well, if you want to kind of sit in the middle of that, 30 to 1 is probably about the right optimal carbon to nitrogen ratio. So you can see at the right there, some of these different materials listed and the carbon to nitrogen ratio for each of those, and it kind of gives you a good comparison. So, so if you've paid much attention to composting in the past, you've heard of these green and brown materials that we want to add to our compost heap. And that's where this carbon to nitrogen ratio kind of all gets sorted out, is between our green materials, which have a little higher nitrogen. And some examples there that I've listed are food scraps, fresh grass clippings. I think it's kind of listed as vegetable scraps on this chart here, but safe to say that they are kind of wet and green things. That's a pretty good summary of what those are. So for the brown materials, which that's again our carbon source, dried leaves, straw, wood chips are great examples. They're basically those dry brown things we can add to our compost. So we need to have a good mixture of the two to make this carbon nitrogen ratio right. I think what happens a lot of times, at least in my compost heap, is I probably get ahead on carbon sometimes, because a lot of us have things like, all my leaves I rake up in the fall, I try to run as many through my compost heap as I can. There's just a lot of things at my house, dead plant stalks from the garden and things, if it's not a particular vegetable crop that has a pathogen associated with it, and we'll talk about that in a minute too. I try to run all that stuff through my compost bin. So you have to think about this as you're adding materials, as you're planning how your composting process is going to happen, again, to optimize things. And if you don't hit it right on the mark, it's going to slow down your composting, is one of the biggest issues. So as you start to pile these materials into a compost bin, what's the optimal arrangement for these materials? And so to me, the optimal arrangement is kind of like this diagram here shows, where we have pretty thin layers of the different materials that are able to really contact each other well. So they're thin layers laid out in a sequence, and they're able to have good contact, and be spread out in a flat layer where, things can kind of intermix a bit as this decomposition process happens. And so how do you do this? Well, in my case, I have a lot of my brown materials kind of stockpiled in different spots, sometimes near my compost heap, sometimes not anywhere near it. But as I'm adding food scraps, I have some of those brown materials around that I'm able to then mix in and kind of keep that carbon to nitrogen ratio about right. So that's been my strategy. There's a lot of different ways you can do it, but keep in mind, this is again kind of like our ideal setting or our ideal situation. We might not always be hitting this exactly perfect. So other than the carbon to nitrogen ratio, there's some other things we'll talk about in these next slides. The first of which is moisture. So believe it or not, your compost bin does need some moisture. So it's a part of this process. So what's the ideal moisture conditions for your compost heap? Probably about 40 to 60% moisture. And so that's kind of described as being like a wrung out sponge. So if you can think of a sponge that you've kind of squeezed and wrung out, it's still pretty moist. It still is holding moisture, but it's not anaerobic. So there still is pore space in there where oxygen can exist. Where oxygen can be available to microorganisms. So definitely the material type can drive that moisture retention in your compost heap. If you have a lot of wet green stuff, you're probably going to have a high amount of moisture in that compost heap, and you may not even need to add any. If you have a lot of brown materials, you're probably going to need some more water, and you may have to add some more water. Again, as those brown materials are higher in carbon, so as we have a greater ratio of carbon to nitrogen in that pile, it's going to decompose slower. So that's going to take a little bit more water and a little bit more time for that decomposition process to happen. And so one of the times I'm always checking my pile is when I turn it. So as you turn your pile, and we'll talk a little bit more about that in another slide, that's a great time to actually add some moisture, and it's a great time to just test that pile and see how moist it is in the inner parts and the outer parts, and kind of add a little water as needed. So oxygen is another component of this, and like we talked about earlier, we want those aerobic bacteria to be doing their thing in there, and we don't want to limit them by, having a low amount of oxygen. So those thermophilic microbes, those heat-loving aerobic microbes, are what we want doing most of that activity. So how do you know if it becomes anaerobic? Well, a lot of times it stinks. A lot of times it's a sticky, mucky mess in the bottom of your compost heap if it's went to an anaerobic condition. So one of the main ways that I've dealt with that is simply by turning my compost pile. I've got some folks add some of these pipes with holes through there. That can add to some air circulation to the bottom of your pile. Some folks have even got fancy enough to add an air blowing system to the back of compost heaps. I haven't found that to be necessary, but again, I'm also willing to accept less than optimal conditions at times. I've put a few pictures of tools in here. On the left there, you can see a compost turning tool. So you can just stick that down in there. It's on a pole. I don't have the whole pole pictured there, but you don't have to bend over. You don't have to do much. You can turn your compost that way, or at least get some aeration going in that. To the right there is a short-handled, like 8 or 9 tine pitchfork, and that's my favorite compost turning tool. I use that for a ton of things in the garden, whether it's just raking away some mulch from something, or as a rake. I use it to spread wood chips around all my landscaping, and I use it to turn the compost heap. One of the most useful tools that we have at our place. So the best way and just the most practical way to keep things aerated is to flip your compost heap either with a shovel, with a pitchfork. I think pitchforks probably work the best because you can get those tines in there. So how often do you need to flip it? Well, it really kind of all depends on how aerobic or anaerobic your pile's getting, on how hot or cold it is, and how fast that decomposition is happening. So that's just something that over time you have to just test by doing it. I'd say probably once a month throughout the growing season, I'm going through and really renovating my compost heap. And I'll talk about that process. I've got some pictures of my personal compost bin system that we can look at and kind of describe that. So temperature in composting also has an effect on a lot of things. So basically, if you want to look at it this way, the hotter it is, the faster those materials can decompose. Again, that's in aerobic conditions. So the colder it is, the slower they're going to decompose. And that's just a fact of these processes and the way those bacteria work. I've put a little table in here that kind of shows you the different temperature points that you need to get to for different things. So, you know, as far as just decomposing organic matter into this, you know, organic humus type material that we want to add to soil, 122 to 128 is kind of the ideal temperature for that. And that's, you know, decomposing plant parts, all the things that we add in there. Whereas if you're adding manure, there's the potential that you could introduce a pathogen from animals. 131 is kind of the temperature at which you need to get to, you know, for sure kill all those pathogens. And then if you look at weed seeds, at about 130 degrees, we start to kill weed seeds. But there's some that can even make it all the way up to 150 degrees. So if you're worried about weed seeds, that you need to really be trying to get your temperature up there. But if you look, it's kind of a narrow window, because above 160 degrees and we start to lose some of those microbes. And if it gets above 179, we've lost all of our beneficial microbes. So it's a fine line there. And I think some folks go as far as to you know, measure the temperature in their compost bin and monitor this. I've always thought that would be super interesting, but I just never have purchased a thermometer, or I'm sure there's probably some cheap ones you could buy if you wanted to check this or test it. For me, I have chose to control what's going into my compost bin on the front side for weed seeds. So that means I'm trying to, if I'm weeding my garden and I'm taking the weed material to my compost heap, I'm making sure and getting in there and weeding before any seed heads have formed. And it's important to remember with some weeds, even though that seed head hasn't formed entirely, that plant can be pulled and it can still keep going. And garlic mustard is probably, it's an invasive species. It's one of the best examples of that I know of, where once a garlic mustard plant has produced flowers, if you pull that out and let it sit on the ground, it can still produce a seed pod after that. So keep that in mind. So if I have some compost that is really weedy and really seedy, I have another place where I take it, and this is actually my compost bin system here in the wintertime. I have another place that I put it that's not here, because this is close to my garden. This is close to a lot of other things. And it's really more of just a compost stack as opposed to a bin or anything. And it's just a place back in the woods where I can dispose of that stuff. So I have the space to do that, which is, some folks might not have that. So at least for weed seeds and things, that's how I've kind of accepted the fact that I may not be getting up to 150 degrees in my compost heap, but I just try and keep the seeds out. And that's been the best method for me in trying to deal with that. Particle size is another factor. So the more surface area we can add to those particles, so the smaller we can chop them up into pieces, the faster they're going to decompose. So a lot of folks do actually use a little shredder to shred up some woody type material. There's other ways you can do this. I've seen folks chop it up with shovels and other things as you're adding it to the pile. I've heard of, like in the case of leaves in your yard, you can kind of double mow those and chop them up with a mower, and that gets another layer of chopping in on those leaves. So you do want to be concerned with particle size, and I guess what I do to control for this is I don't add any large sticks, any large pieces of wood, even sometimes plant stalks and things that are a little too big. I don't add to my compost heap right away. I again have like another kind of area where some things can kind of sit in a pile and decompose a bit before I would ever add that stuff. So anyway, that's kind of the way I've dealt with the particle size thing. But just be aware that if you do put those bigger chunks in, obviously they're going to take a little longer to decompose, and that can throw off your finishing compost and actually getting done. So let's look at the stages of hot composting. So in the early stages, and let's say this is right as you throw the stuff into the pile, in those first 1 to 2 days, those microbes really start to work on the easy to break down stuff. And it's a fast, it happens pretty quickly. That pile starts to heat up quite a bit in those early couple days while that easy to break down stuff is being consumed by the microbes. After about 3 days to the next few weeks, we get into this hot phase of it. So the temperature gets up above 100 or so. Some of these heat-loving microbes become active and they really start to fuel this decomposition. And remember, the warmer we get, the faster that happens. So like we talked about in the last slide, 131 is kind of that point where most seeds and animal plant pathogens, so diseased plant material that you would add to your pile, those pathogens would likely be killed by 131 degrees or higher. If you're getting compost that's a little too hot, if you turn that, you may have to turn a little more often. And so how would you know that it's getting too hot? Well, you know, I like to give the example of a pile of wood chips. I don't know if you guys have ever dug into a huge, huge pile of wood chips, or if you've seen like an arborist truck dump its bed load, but steam comes off of those piles. And inside a pile of wood chips, that temperature can pretty easily get up to 150 and can sometimes be up above 200 degrees pretty easily. And so at those, things kind of start to smolder. You start to see some hot steamy stuff coming off as you take a scoop of wood chips. So that's usually an indication things are getting too hot. I'd say in my own personal situation, I really don't have an issue with things getting too hot. I'm probably on the too cold side. So finally, in this maturation or curing phase, that compost kind of stabilizes into the consistency it's going to be. The process of decomposition kind of slows down, and it just takes a little while for that to kind of mature or cure, which again kind of depends on all these other factors we've talked about: particle size, moisture, temperature, all these things. So it's anywhere from weeks to months is how we communicate that length of time. So now let's talk about passive composting, where you're just going to compost your waste materials as it becomes available. And that's what I probably would say I fall more into this category. I try and optimize this process to the best of my ability, but it's not as good of a finished product. You may have weed seeds in there if you're not careful about what goes in. I've been able to successfully not have a smelly compost pile without doing a heck of a lot. I just, again, have some brown material I can add in as I'm adding kitchen scraps. But, it's definitely going to be slower. I would say that I have a 3-bin system, if you saw that in that last picture, and we'll look at it again here in another couple slides. But I have a 3-bin system, and I would say it's probably about a year from bin 1 to bin 3 before I have a kind of a finished product. And I don't have a real great calculation or measurement for that, but that's what I would probably guess. And just kind of talking with my wife, she does a lot of the compost management along with me. We thought it was probably about a year or so it would take. We asked you guys for some questions ahead of time. And so I've tried to kind of cover some of the general questions that came in and things throughout this talk, but one of the main questions folks asked is, what's your favorite compost bin design or type of way to make it out of? So here's some of those questions. What do you want to make your compost bin out of? I've made them from everything from fencing, like you see here in this kind of fenced-in container, to wood. My current compost bin system is made out of pallets I got for free from a neighbor that has a business that has pallets sitting around. So I think what I've learned over the years is it's a compost bin. It's kind of gross. It's probably good to get something free or recycled or something cheap. And it's, when you start looking at, the sustainability aspect of composting, if you can use recycled materials, that's an even more sustainable aspect of it. So yeah, definitely you can use recycled materials. I highly encourage it. Some old scrap lumber, some 2x4, some fencing. I think our first compost bins were actually just circles of old fencing, just in a circle. And up to the point where we moved out of our last home, that was kind of our main composting system, was some large just bins that were big circles of fence. And when we went to turn it, I would just pull that fence away from the pile, and it was kind of a stack there, and then shovel it back in and turn the whole thing over. So how's the pile going to be contained? That's something to consider. So if you look at those bins at the top there, there's some stuff that can leak out the sides of those. So although those slats are pretty close together and can hold a lot of our, really brown material and really undecomposed stuff, as it gets finer and finer, it can leak out. So a helpful addition to this bin system may be just some mesh or some wire screening on that to hold materials in if that's a problem. In my case, with my pallet constructed compost bins, I'm okay if stuff just kind of spills out around it. I just shovel it back in every once in a while, or it's on the ground turning into soil right around there. You can just kind of shovel it back in with some of the other stuff around there. You really want to think about aeration. So that's probably the biggest amount of work in managing a compost heap, is that turning of the compost. And you don't, it's not absolutely required that you turn compost constantly, but again, you're going to optimize all these processes. You're going to better use those microbes that are there and ready to decompose things. So, so think about that. In the case of this bin system at the top, they would have to slide out some slats there. So those slots like slide up to the top of those, the front parts of those bins, and they just slide those off, and then you're able to dig into the bin. Where with that wire set up there, like I said, the best way I found to deal with those was just to take the wire away from the heap, set it up next to it if you have room to move it over a few feet, and then shovel everything back in. So a final question on this list is, how sturdy does it need to be? It does need to be sturdy enough to kind of hold up to this material pressing against the sides like this. Obviously, this wire bin is plenty strong. Wood connected together is plenty strong. One thing to pay attention to, though, is how the front ends of the bins connect. It's going to be the critical part if you build one out of wood, but needs to be pretty sturdy enough just to kind of stand up on its own and hold back some pressure, but it doesn't have to be designed to the engineering specifications of a bridge or something. So it can be pretty homemade. I've had pretty good luck with just using common sense in how I constructed things out of wood and adding an extra screw here or there, and they tend to be pretty sturdy that way. So here's a picture again of my composting system in the wintertime. And so I do follow this 3-bin system where if you look at my front gate to my, home, definitely homemade. It definitely looks homemade when you look at it in this picture. Compost bin system. I just have a fence, some scrap fencing there that was extra draped across, and at the right there's a piece of wood I've attached to that fencing, and I can kind of bend it around the corner, and I have a little piece of wire that I can attach it. So I simply just have a fence as a gate right there, kind of holding things back. Now, one thing that's probably a little different in my composting process than a lot of others is this white building right here is our chicken coop. So that you can see a little side door right there on the side of the building where my chickens come out. So they do have access to our compost heap, and I view that as kind of they're doing some of the the processes that those macroorganisms do by breaking things up a little bit and mixing things up. And so I think they actually, and I like the fact that my chicken's free range, they're able to eat things out of there. They're able to diversify their diet out of there. I know I'm putting safe materials in there, so there's nothing to worry about harming them. And so that's a little different for my system. And that's kind of why I don't have a really thick gate right there. I don't want, I want the chickens to be able to get in there and access it. So in bin 1, so that would be the right-hand bin here, that's where we're putting fresh food waste. So that stuff that comes right out of our kitchen is going right in there. If I have some grass clippings, those are going right in there. What you can't see behind me is I have some areas where I've blown leaves and piles of leaves where I can have some brown material close by. Behind us in this picture is a woods line. So there's a forest behind us. And so right in that edge of the forest, it's easy to leaf blow up some big piles of leaves out of this area you see around here. Bin 2 is for stuff out of bin 1 that is, starting to actively decompose. And that's where I'm really kind of adding in some brown material and getting this optimal mix as I enter bin 2. Bin 3 is finished or very close. And so the final step in all of this is as bin 2 starts to really break down, I'm shoveling some of that, I turn that stuff, and then I actually take some of what was the bottom of bin 2 that I've flopped on the top. That's what I'm looking at to add to bin 3, because some of that stuff on the bottom is usually kind of the most decomposed at that point. But it does become a little bit of a balancing act between when you shift things from bin to bin and how you're constantly adding stuff if you're truly composting everything you have. So you do have to, it really pays to have all 3 of these bins. And I've tried it with fewer, and I think at least the way it works at my house, this is probably about the best system for home composting. So recently here, we actually did some compost bin construction here in Vermilion County for a couple of Master Gardener projects we have out at Kennecott County Park. So we have this area is referred to as the Bunker Hill area, and we have an herb garden there that you can see a picture of, and we also maintain some beautiful ornamental gardens around the Atwood House, which is a historic home from the 1800s that was moved here. And there's several other buildings in this Bunker Hill area that were moved there. So the Master Gardeners have wanted or needed a composting bin somewhere between these two spots. And so finally this summer, it was the year for us to actually get one out there and install it. And it was kind of a fun learning experience for us as part of this program too. So here's kind of an aerial view of the whole area, the whole Bunker Hill area in this park. And I just want to look at this for a minute because I get a question a lot of where should I put my compost bin? And I know this is a rural area and is really spread out. Some of us are in an urban area with a really small yard and only one possible spot. But if you have more space, it does pay to kind of think about where that could be located. So when we start to look at where to put a compost heap here, the current composting area was more of the stack style, and that's where it's just like it sounds. It's a stack that you pile up on the ground. There's nothing that contains it. Again, it's probably not optimized, but it's a good way to just decompose things. That was going on, off to the right of the herb garden here along that woods line. So that's where they'd kind of been taking their compost materials. Hey, it's a park. We can just kind of let them naturally decompose there. So one of the first things we looked at was something centrally located between the Atwood House and the herb garden. And as we looked at that area, there's a few other buildings there. There's the public walks around on those sidewalks. There just really wasn't a great spot that was centrally located to everything and still kind of out of the way, because you really don't want your compost heap right in your front yard or right on a property line where a neighbor could get annoyed by it, or just in a super visible spot. It's nice to kind of tuck it away in the back. So what we found after kind of looking around is that right here, that dark spot is actually an old stump that they've had problems kind of getting rid of, and it wasn't a very well mowed area because there's a stump sticking up and it was just uneven. And so that's where we decided was probably our best spot to put the compost bins, because it kind of deals with two problems at once. It was already a problem area. Let's put our compost bin over it. We can actually, it's kind of an interesting experiment to decompose this stump underneath our compost pile. So that was the location we chose, and we accepted the fact that, again, it's a little further from Atwood House, but still easily accessible from the herb garden. So again, this is just another picture of my 3-bin system, this time during the growing season. And you can see this was kind of the inspiration for the compost bins we designed at Atwood House in the herb garden. We chose not to have as also because it was kind of in the public view, we didn't necessarily want just pallets slapped together like Ryan did here. I just kind of added some screws and a few pieces of wood to these pallets and it held them together. So we chose to actually use, here's just another picture of kind of the difference between bin 1, where materials are kind of starting out, and I've added a bunch of brown material there, to this was our finished product this spring that actually some of it I think was already shoveled out. But so that was kind of what we harvested. That's a good example or picture of kind of a finished product. And I'll have a few tips on how to identify once you get to your finished product, how to identify that in another slide or so here. You can also see in the middle picture there that my wonderful pitchfork, one of my favorite tools. So that's they're a little bit hard to find, but if you can find one of those, they definitely are one of the best turning tools we can get. So this isn't the best aerial photo, but this is a picture of my property. And so you can see where my compost bins are. They're right behind our chicken coop, which is close to our garden. So we have a fairly good sized garden. I wish that we produced enough organic matter that I could say it covered our needs in the garden, but we probably are bringing in outside inputs from time to time to be able to keep our organic matter in the soil up. But this was strategically located to be out of the way, not visible from the road. Close to the chicken coop was another reason, because we have animal waste out of the chicken coop that we're, again, kind of recycling through this. And we have several other animal buildings that are kind of in the woods line right here that you can see. So it was close to all those places where we have animal bedding materials that we're trying to decompose. And then in our barn there, we had water. So you do want to be kind of close to water, and the event you need to add it. Now, the downside to this is you can see this dotted line is the path that I have to take from my kitchen all the way out to the compost bin. So that's probably the downside to this. And in hindsight, it might have been better to put that about halfway between the house and the chicken coop. Chickens would find it anyway. They get around and they find stuff. But that's something to maybe think about, is striking a balance between way off in the back corner of your yard and right up next to your back door. It's nice and convenient to have it kind of close. How we've solved this problem is we just bought one of those kitchen compost bins that sits on your countertop. It's just a little bucket of a thing with a nice, neat little lid. And once a day, we just go dump that out in the compost heap. So it's just part of our daily process of what we do, and it's made it just a little easier because we have a designated spot or container that goes in. So again, here is just back to the Bunker Hill area. Here's again where we're going to build our compost bins there, as you see circled. And so what we chose to do, instead of using, again, like the recycled pallets, we chose to actually use some rough sawn lumber to do this. So it's a little cheaper than, your kind of finished lumber product. But one thing you do want to think about in all of this is any type of chemical additives and treated lumber, or any of those things that could eventually make it into your compost, that could eventually make it into your garden space. So we chose cedar for this, and just some rough sawn cedar. It was a cheap lumber product. But one of the problems we had right off the bat was because of that stump and the lack of mowing there, it was a little bit uneven. So you can see me there with a level. I'm trying to kind of get, again, I'm not engineering a bridge here, but I do want it to be kind of start basically level. So that was kind of the first step here, was kind of digging, getting the ground level. And then as we kind of got the upright posts built, I did test level again and just kind of get the first couple boards attached, and then things kind of came together pretty nicely once you get a few boards screwed up. But you can see in the base of each of our bins, we actually used that's a 4x4 post around each base. And I have built them two different ways, with a board across the front and without. The thinking behind not having a board across the front there, and here, let me flip to the actual finished product. Not having this board across the front here allows you to more easily scoop into there, but I also feel like it really lets stuff kind of fall out. So I found that in the ones we've built, I like to have that little kind of board across the front of each bin at the toe. It tends to kind of just help stuff stack up and stay in there. So another thing that we did with this one is you can see some small cross members on the ends of the bin, bins at the base. So that was just to add a little more strength to the base of each one of these, and it worked nicely. All those posts came in 10-foot lengths. We needed 4-foot lengths for all of our bin sides, so we had about 2 feet off of each one of those posts that we cut of waste material. This allowed me to almost use all of our waste material. I think I had an extra post because we bought too many, and I had maybe one extra board left when we got done. But I probably could have measured and planned a little better and got those materials right on the money. But one thing that we haven't added to this is a front, and that's something that we're just going to kind of see how things work. We may actually construct a wood gate kind of a style to go across the front, but I do really like just the wire fencing for its simplicity. You can just peel away the whole fence at once and replace it. So we may go to a kind of a wire fence type style, a lot similar, very similar to what I did at my house. So another question that we get pretty commonly is, should I locate my compost bin in the shade or in the sun? And I guess the right answer to that is it really kind of depends, like a lot of things. I think probably the optimal setting would be part sun for part of the day and part shade for the other part of the day. My compost bin, it wasn't intentional, but gets partial shade for the last half of the day. This compost system is going to be out in the full sun. So what's the difference? Well, on the side of heat, you've got an advantage. So it's going to stay warmer That can potentially fuel a little more decomposition in the wintertime, especially as we get colder temperatures. But with respect to water and moisture, you may have to add a little bit more water and moisture at times, where if you had a more shaded spot, again, you're going to be cooler and slower in the decomposition process, but you may not have to add as much water. So that's how I usually answer that question. It kind of depends. And I think a lot of times, especially in town, if you live in town, it's dictated to you where this compost bin has to go based on where you have space in your yard a lot of times. So a lot of times there's not a huge decision-making factor in this. But if you had the choice, kind of on the edge of shade and sun is where the best place is. I really caution folks against putting these over the root system of a tree or very close, because you tend to get tree roots up in there. And while the tree is probably loving your compost, it's kind of a hassle to dig and turn and get stuff out of the bottom when you have tree roots developing in there. So consider that too in your placement, and try and get outside of the root system of any shade tree you may have. So now let's look at just a couple other designs. These are kind of either commercially made tumblers, or you can see there's a homemade version on the left there. I can't say that I've ever used these, but they are definitely readily available in the garden centers and just a lot of retail outlets. You can buy these. They probably are pretty efficient use of a smaller space. So if you're in town, this may be a little bit more of a consideration. I like the fact that you can turn the whole unit, and you can turn it up, roll it around quite a bit. I also like the fact that this one on the right has a couple chambers to it. So I honestly, again, I go to this 3-bin system where I have kind of a rotating process for all my compost. I think if I was going to go to one of these, I think I'd like to either have a couple of those or a couple different chambers in my bins, so I could mix things up, or I could let some of that more finished compost kind of rest and finish in a place of its own there. So here's just some other examples. We've kind of looked at a chicken wire type fence. It was a square wire. Again, I've had really good luck with just the circles of wire in a big round circle. So the middle diagram there is a trash can with some holes in it. And why do you think they have the holes in it? That's for aeration, to keep air in there and in movement. You know, a wood pallet bin can be designed as a single bin, and you could have your bins in a couple different spots. You don't have to have the 3-bin system right next to each other. So if you don't mind moving stuff around, or if you don't have room in one place for all 3, you can kind of split them up and build, singular pallets or wood bins like that. There's different block bins. I've seen that done really effectively, and what's more durable than a block wall. So but do notice on that block bin design, they've left some holes there so air can kind of infiltrate in the sides. You wouldn't want to have just a total brick wall on the sides. And finally, just another type of fencing, or an example of one with kind of a snow fence type thing. So another interesting type of garden that I have learned about from the Vermilion County Master Gardeners are keyhole gardens. And I had not heard about these until I came to Extension and started to work with the Vermilion County folks. And so if you look at the top picture on the right, a couple of our master gardeners are actually planting this new keyhole garden. And you can see there's a little hole down the center of this garden. That's where you would add compost. So you have a spot there that is actively decomposing down into the soil below, and plant roots can access that. And it's a really neat, sustainable system where you're adding your compost kind of right to the garden soil there. There's one design on the right there. You can see they're initially planting. At the bottom, look at the growth on all those plants in there. So you can really grow a lot in one of those. The green bin at the left there then has a little inlet in the side, and you can walk in and deposit your compost right in there. And we hardly can see the inlet from all the plant growth that's in that. So really are highly productive little gardens that, of course, raise beds. So they have a lot of that benefit. These are actually kits that were purchased. This is another thing that just works wonderfully for use of recycled materials, or just building it from what you have around the house. And if you just do a Google search of keyhole gardens, you can see, folks around the world use these, and they're built from anything and everything you can think of. So check out some pictures on the internet if you're interested. The kits aren't super expensive, but they definitely aren't free. So I always look to try and recycle some type of material or use something else first. But anyway, neat and interesting concept. And if you have the space, that's a nice way to compost directly to your plants. Okay, so now we've talked about a lot of the different aspects of bins, but one of the biggest questions I get in composting is what can you put in your compost bin? So all the things we've kind of talked about, leaves, straw, wood chips that are small enough, grass clippings, food scraps that are plant-based now. That's an interesting point to pay attention to, is plant-based food scraps. Shredded paper or paper towels, obviously manure, and disease-free garden waste. So that's stems and leaves and stalks and things from your garden that didn't die because of a pathogen that naturally may have died at the end of the year, and you're going to put in there, or you've pruned some leaves off of something and you need to add it. That's what we're talking about with disease-free garden waste, because it's important to understand some of those pathogens can be transmitted. And if you remember where my garden or where my compost bin was at, that's pretty close to my garden. That's close enough that, spores from a fungus could potentially be airborne to my garden. I would say at Kennecott, we also probably are close enough. There's a bit of a risk of disease transmission if we were to put diseased materials in there. So what should we not add? Animal-based food scraps. So that's anything that's meat, that's dairy, that's cheese. Something I realized I don't have on these slides that is also a factor are even, oils. If you have a lot of oil, a lot of olive oil for some reason, that's not really animal-based, but those oils break down much slower and can change the composition of your compost too, and can be an issue. But charcoal ash we wouldn't want to use. It has meat and grease probably mixed into it. Diseased plant material, like anything off a tomato plant. We have a picture of some dead tomatoes here on the right. I really don't. I have a special place that tomato type materials go, and not in my regular compost. Just big things like walnuts. Man, the closest tree to my compost bin is a walnut tree. And I really wish that I could just compost all those walnuts, but I guarantee they would make it all the way to the third bin and really barely be decomposed with just as thick as those nut shells are. So large sticks, any of that big stuff is really not going to work. And for obvious reasons, pet waste, human waste, there's the potential of pathogens being in that. So we definitely don't want those things in our compost. So I've kind of covered this. You may want to have a hazmat place for compost. You may want to have a separate pile for diseased plants. I put all tomatoes, like all material coming off of tomato plants. They just have so many pathogens on their leaves that can be spread later. It's a good idea to just have a separate place for those. A trash can with air holes drilled in it for some aeration is kind of a good way to do this. If you really want to have them contained, you've got to have a little bit of airflow in there, but there's not a lot that's going to get out of a trash can with holes drilled in it. So that's probably the coolest thing I've seen for a hazmat type compost area. Again, I've just got mine far away from my garden in places I feel like it could spread infection. So that's kind of how I've dealt with that. So how do you know when your compost is finished? Well, finished compost is crumbly. Like this stuff in my bin 3 this spring that we pulled out, it's about like coffee grounds. It's crumbly, it's light, it's fluffy. It has a good earthy scent. It smells a lot like soil. It shouldn't have any kind of a bad smell to it. It shouldn't be gummy and gooey. You can kind of see some little clumps in here in my bin there. I was really careful before I started to spread that to reach down in there and bust up some of those clumps and just make sure it wasn't solid chunks of really green stuff that had not decomposed yet. But it was just a little bit clumpy because it was maybe wet when we shoveled it last. So that's the best way I can tell you. It's not going to be something stinky. It's going to be fairly homogeneous. You can see maybe a few little kind of stems or stalks of some plants that didn't quite decompose or something in there, but pretty homogeneous, pretty similar to, like I said, kind of coffee grounds. It's a little lighter than soil, but should have a pretty good consistency. So how should you apply it? A lot of folks apply it as a surface mulch. You can just spread it on the surface and let it kind of naturally incorporate itself into the soil, 2 to 4 inches deep around plants. Only problem is it doesn't work as its own total mulch because weeds can grow in that compost. So you'll see you'll probably get some weed growth back there. So in times when I've done that, I've usually had a plan to, like, some of this stuff I spread, some of our finished compost this spring, I spread right before I planted stuff and then covered it with a mulch then. So in a thin layer on the surface, and spread and covered it with mulch. So the other way is as a true soil amendment that we would till in. So as just a rough estimate, they're about 2 to 4 bushels per 100 square feet. So, you know, I can think about some of my gardening beds are about 10 by 10, you know, or, well, I guess they're about 3 feet wide by 10 or 12 feet. So try and kind of visualize that 100 square foot area. And, you know, I think we can all picture a bushel basket, 2 to 4 of those per, you know, 100-foot square areas. So, for more information, Illinois Extension does have this Composting in the Home Garden website. You'll see a lot of the same information I covered tonight is in here. There's some great pictures of some different types of compost bins. And I do really like the troubleshooting section here. It goes through a lot of, what if I have smelly compost? What if it's not decomposing fast enough? Well, it answers a lot of those questions. So check that out if you're interested. So with that, I'll go to this final slide, and the composting website is at the bottom here. I've also listed my contact information. I really thank everybody that submitted questions ahead of time to this. It really gave me a chance to kind of address a lot of things in this presentation. I'd say given our size of crowd tonight, we're probably not going to take live questions, but if you guys still have questions about any of these slides, about anything in this presentation, or just want to run some ideas by me about your home compost, there's my contact information. Feel free to email me or give me a call. If you're interested, I write a weekly gardening blog called The Garden Scoop, and it's available at the web address there. And so check it out. I post there about once a week. You know, it's about a lot of different gardening topics. I'd say the things that I focus on are probably vegetable gardening. And then the second thing that I have the most expertise in is probably trees and forestry and arboriculture. So you'll see a lot of different content like that written. But anyway, I try to cover all different aspects of gardening in the blog. And so I decided to leave us with this nice winter picture of my compost bin system so we can feel nice and cool on this hot July evening. So with that, thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. And I appreciate your time. And thanks again.